We shouldn't overlook the impact of the regulation on domestic operators. There is little capacity within member states and their competent authorities to understand how to implement this regulation. All these missing pieces create risk, liability for operators here in Europe. It's a no-brainer that we should prioritize bigger leaks first and get those resources where it's needed from operators' perspective.
Welcome everybody to Drilling Down, IAGP's podcast on all things energy. My name is Nareg. I'm the head of strategy and communications at IAGP Europe, and I'm joined today by Emils, our senior officer in charge of methane issues, to discuss the EU's methane regulation. Welcome, Emils, on the show. I'm very happy to have you here. It's been a while.
Thank you, Nareg. Thanks for having me.
Cool. So we are going to talk, as I said, about the EU methane regulation. The regulation has entered into force in August of 2024. So we are just a year over that time now. We've experienced some of the implementation challenges, but there are many more that we are going to discuss today. The regulation was proposed a few years before 2024, and this is a regulation our sector was initially very supportive of because it fit very well with the industry's commitment to reduce methane emissions. We've seen the initiatives of the methane guiding principle, for example, which is now incorporated into IAGP's own work. We've seen the initiatives of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter. So a lot of industry initiatives to get methane leakage under control while preserving, of course, the safety of our operations. We know that this is a credibility issue for natural gas. The industry is very conscious of this. And so that's a goal we all collectively got behind. However, I think it's fair to say the regulation ended up somewhat more prescriptive than what was initially intended for various reasons, political reasons, among others. And as I said, there are operational challenges that we are now starting to face and others we are seeing on the horizon. So today we wanted to perhaps go with you, Emils, over the purpose of the regulation very briefly. I mentioned it. Where we are in the legislative process a year after entry into force. But as we will discuss, there are other legislative milestones to come. The challenges in the way of implementation, the risks, very important, that could arise as a consequence of those challenges if we do not anticipate and potentially solve some of these problems. And when we talk about risk, we have to talk then about ways to mitigate them. So that's our program for today. I'm sure you're going to share all your expertise. I know it's immense. I'm going to try and get the most out of that expertise today for our listeners and viewers. And so I would suggest we dive straight into it. Let's go over a quick overview for those who may have forgotten or who may not know about the methane regulation. Let's just look at it briefly. What is the purpose of the regulation, its impact, etc. So do you want to remind us of what the regulation was designed for initially at EU level?
Sure. So the methane regulation really comes out of the context of the Green Deal, and it was, one of the many pieces of legislation that the European Commission put forward 2021, 22. Came into force already last year, 4th of August. So we're, as you said, a bit more than 1 year into implementation. The objective really is to reduce methane emissions across the value chain of oil and gas, as well as coal. So we'll obviously focus on oil and gas today. It does target different parts of the segments. There are different mitigation requirements, be it the leak detection and repairs, LDAR, or minimizing venting and flaring, as well as addressing methane emissions from some of the wells as well. And then there's reporting of the methane emissions as well, because obviously it's important to understand what we reduce and what are the methane emissions associated with the oil and gas industry. And that's more the MRV, the monitoring, reporting, and verification of the methane emissions. Mm-hmm. And that's for the domestic side. And then there is a huge component that deals with the importer requirements as well. Yes. As you know, majority of oil and gas that is consumed in Europe is imported from third countries. So for the European Commission and EU institutions at large, it was very important to also address those methane emissions that are associated with imported crude oil and natural gas. And that's solely for the producers in the third countries whose molecules reach European markets.
Okay, so you pointed out to a very important element of of this regulation, but of course there are others with the similar characteristic, which is the extraterritoriality of the purpose of the regulation. As you said, we import almost all of the gas we consume in Europe. I think our demand stands at around just over 300 BCM right now. It has gone down significantly. Our supply architecture has also changed as the share of Russian gas has dropped dramatically. Now we are turning more and more to LNG. We expect that share to continue growing. And so this regulation is, as you said, of great interest to producers outside of Europe. And that has an impact on the importers in Europe. So thanks for also reminding us that it's a value chain. It has a value chain scope. You mentioned the sectors, oil and gas and coal. Agriculture is not in it. I think it's important to remind our listeners and viewers that is perhaps the biggest source of methane emissions in Europe at the moment. So it's focused on energy. Okay. So you mentioned the entry into force last year. How far along are we? So what is meant to happen now? Is this it? It's a regulation. It's not a directive. I think it's also important to remind us that a regulation, when it enters into force, is applied universally as it is in Europe. So member states cannot, let's say, tweak the way it enters into force in the nations. And so what comes now? A year in, what do we still have to expect from a legislative standpoint?
Sure. Both domestically, operators already have to implement some of the requirements, be the LDAR requirements. Operators earlier this year had to inform their competent authorities of the LDAR plans, and then already in early August complete some of part of the LDAR surveys. There's also requirements for MRV, also for domestic producers that were required this year. And then similarly also for importers, the first sort of phase, because there's 3 phases, and we'll speak about it, I'm sure, a bit later. But the first phase deals with Annex 9 reporting of certain, let's say, qualitative and quantitative information the importers have to submit to competent authorities in the member states. There are a lot of different secondary pieces of legislation the Commission has to adopt still. Unfortunately, some of it is behind schedule. For example, the LDAR Implementing Act that sets minimum detection limits, because currently regulation only sets the repair limits, but you need to have an understanding of the detection limits and also the methods that the Commission or the Implementing Act would prescribe in carrying out the LDAR surveys. This is still missing. It was supposed to come out already in the first quarter this year, and it's still work in progress, unfortunately. And there are also reporting templates and MRV equivalency procedural aspects that are applied to the importers or the third countries. That's also something that we're still expecting from the Commission, let's say in coming months, hopefully.
So if I understand correctly, and let me just take a second to perhaps translate some of the acronyms for our listeners. LDAR, leak detection and repair. MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification. What I understand from what you're saying is that the milestones that are set by the regulation are there, but the details on how to actually, let's say, deliver against all milestones have not yet been defined, and therefore time is running by, but industry still doesn't know how it's going to be asked to comply with the requirements by certain dates. Is that a fair summary of what you're saying?
I think that's a fair summary indeed. I think the issue here is, or a positive aspect here is, operators can use their best practices for the time being until the standards are in place. And that obviously is very much welcomed. But operators also need to make significant investments in order to comply with the regulation here domestically, but also in third countries. So there is obviously a risk that whatever comes out from the standards or implementing acts or delegated acts would require operators to rethink the way they're doing and implementing these requirements in their operations. So that's obviously the uncertainty. And there, as I said, there are many pieces of legislation or secondary legislation that still is missing that would obviously have to be adopted as soon as possible to provide that clarity the operators, but also the importers who indirectly require data and information from producers in third countries.
Okay. I think you showed in a couple of minutes how complex all of this is. This is, I think I have to remind people that this is one of the most complex pieces of legislation that I remember, working on, at least at IGP Europe, in a long time. So because of the nature of the market, because of the technicality of what it means to actually tackle methane emissions, because of the, let's say, because of the entire scope of operations across a value chain, it is inherently complex. So I'd like us to come back to some of the risks or challenges that you mentioned. You hinted at uncertainty felt by industry for good reason. Can we perhaps take stock of where the discussion around the implementation of the regulation stands today? And I'd like you to maybe say a few more words about how industry is feeling about this, but also how member states, because they are also figuring things out as this regulations implementation goes forward. And also from our partners that supply the gas to Europe, and I believe one of them was very vocal lately, and that is, of course, as you could expect, the United States. So industry, member states, trade partners, what are they saying a year into implementation right now to policymakers or to each other?
Indeed, I think it's been quite a big learning curve for everyone on this topic, or from the perspective of the regulation. Obviously, the industry has the know-how, and as you mentioned earlier, the industry has been doing quite a lot on methane management and also measurement reporting. But it definitely has been, from the regulatory perspective, a big learning curve for everyone. From member state perspective, what we hear on the ground is that there's little capacity within member states and their competent authorities to understand how to implement this regulation. Many of the member states were supposed to appoint their competent authorities already earlier this year in February. That was not the case. There are still some of the member states missing, or competent authorities in some of the member states missing. So obviously there is, let's say, no door to knock on for the industry to seek clarifications and answers and guidance where it is needed from the sort of regulatory perspective. From the industry perspective, as I mentioned, the secondary legislation, one of the missing pieces, but there are other uncertainties, being the challenges of traceability, or the lack of a third-party verification protocol, or the standardization, which is now an ongoing process in European and international standardization organizations. But all of these missing pieces create risk, liability, create risk for operators here in Europe, but also in terms of the importers, where importers do not, or they're reluctant to take up the risk in case they're not able to source compliant crude oil or natural gas for the European market in the future.
Can you remind us, I didn't mention this, but you brought it up, the penalties foreseen by the regulation in case of non-compliance. They're quite severe, hence also the perception of the risk. Do you have the numbers in mind?
Yes, so the penalties, that's another missing element, because the regulation basically allows member states to design their own penalties, or set their own penalties. The regulation sets a cap, which is up to 20% of the previous year's turnover.
Total turnover.
Yes, so it's an incredible amount if member states decide to put that as a maximum. Now, there are a couple of member states that have designed their penalties now as low as a couple of €1,000, at least for this year, because they understand the complexity of the regulation. And so that's another risk or another uncertainty that companies have here in Europe, is the fragmentation of the regulation or the implementation of this regulation,
yes,
and an interpretation of the regulation. Already from the first days of the implementation, we could have already seen between two large member states the very different understanding and interpretation of some of the requirements for importers, for example, which I think is a very important thing to note.
Okay. So about member states, I remember that a few months ago, in fact, over the summer, you mentioned that they were they were facing a steep learning curve, and that they had capacity issues. I recall that there was an Energy Council meeting where they voiced some of those concerns, of course, at a high level. But can you maybe just tell us what happened there? Because I think that was kind of if you're an EU bubble nerd, that is quite an important declaration that they made, but perhaps tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, I think it was important also if we maybe take 2 steps back. The regulation in the trilogues and actually the whole legislative process was really rushed through for the Commission or for the European Union to have something on the table to present to COP a couple of years ago.
True.
So from that perspective, also then there was, from a member state perspective, there was little capacity and understanding of this very technical file, and it's understandable because it is very technical, and we understand that. But now that the implementation has started, it means that slowly member states are understanding or trying to understand what are the implications, what it would actually require for member states to implement this in practice, and they are realizing, hey, there are issues and there are things that we are not able to implement or that we need help with. But there is a lack of, let's say, exchange and information sharing between the Commission and member states. The Commission has established competent authorities, network of competent authorities that has already met twice this year. So that's a positive evolution where the Commission and member states can meet together and discuss the best way to implement the regulation. But out of that, there has also been frustration from the member states who have realized that there are certain elements in the regulation that are either not implementable or are disproportionate. So you had a set of, I think, 6 member states that had put this up for a discussion in the Council a couple of months ago. And that concluded in June, 16th of June, with the presidency conclusions where there was a support from the member states to ask Commission to consider assessing whether methane regulation should be included in the energy omnibus, which is upcoming in 2026. So we see also from the member state level that there is an understanding now and growing frustration about some of the elements that would likely need to be adjusted in order to ensure effective implementation of the regulation, whilst maintaining the objective, because I don't think that anyone is against the objective of the regulation, which is to reduce methane emissions. The industry is behind it, member states are behind it. We have net zero that's enshrined in the law, so that's something that we have to work with, and we want to work with as well. But it's how we get there, and sort of asking ourselves whether some of the elements that are in the regulation are necessary from the operational perspective, and whether there's an alternative approaches that could be taken in order to have more cost-effective reductions of the methane emissions here domestically in the EU, but also looking outside of the EU for producers in third countries.
So there was unanimity to issue conclusions calling for the methane regulation to undergo specific changes to solve the problems that you mentioned already. In an upcoming energy omnibus, which, for those who don't know what it is basically a way where usually a new incoming commission can, through what is called an omnibus, make changes to a set of legislative files to tweak certain aspects. And so the member states of the EU have called on the Commission to do that over the summer. And I guess our third stakeholder, which is the US, has also been recently vocal. There was a visit of the US Secretary for Energy in Brussels a few weeks ago. And maybe you want to mention a few words. So what did Chris Wright, is his name, what does Chris Wright tell people in town?
I think that the main message from Chris Wright was basically this regulation is not implementable, so certain things have to change to make it implementable. Obviously, US already has an established framework or regulatory framework that tackles or deals with MRV, the monitoring, reporting, and verification of methane emissions in oil and gas sector. And I'm sure that there are discussions between the European Commission and the administration in the US. But as I said, US increasingly become the largest natural gas importer into Europe. So it's not surprising that the US are becoming more vocal on this, and that it's really an important aspect for them. But what we hear is that the operators in the US and also other countries, they are committed to this, but they also are looking and seeking any sort of approaches or ways in ensuring that this can be implemented in the most effective way that makes sense, and it doesn't require, let's say, disproportionate measures to be taken by operators.
Okay, so we've got industry aligned on the challenges, obviously. The trade associations in Brussels have come together asking or raising the concerns and challenges and asking for the Commission to consider amendments. The member states have done the same. The US has basically done the same. Can we just recap quickly what on the import side and the domestic side? So what matters most for imports? Let's go over that first quickly.
So as I mentioned, import requirements are phased in stages. So this year, from August already, importers and importers have to report to competent authorities on certain information that's required of them in Annex 9. The second stage starts in 2027. From the 1st of January, importers must ensure that the imported natural gas and crude oil basically subject to the same measurement, reporting, and verification standards in third countries at the producer level as those set in Article 12 for domestic producers here in Europe or equivalent, or alternatively OGMP level 5, an oil and gas partnership framework that's already been established for a couple of years now. It tackles methane emissions across the whole value chain, not only upstream. It's a voluntary framework where companies subscribe to and then progressively move from, let's say, less granular data to more granular direct measurement, site level measurement based data in level 5. From 2028, importers have to then report on the methane intensity of the imported oil and gas. And then from 2030, in between, the Commission will assess and make a report and set different methane intensities for different supply chains or different regions from countries. Certain methane intensities that have to be met from 2030 onwards. So that'll be basically a maximum methane intensity cap put on imported natural gas as well as crude oil. Now, 2027, in sort of commercial terms and operational terms, just, that's tomorrow, basically.
Yeah. So
implementing the MRE criteria is difficult. There are still struggles with meeting level 5. I think there is this assumption that the companies can progress, within 3 years to level 5 easily. But we've seen in practical terms, when you actually look at the OGMP data, that at level 5, and this is for the whole value chain, methane emissions in oil and gas, for level 5, there's about only 5% of methane emissions were reported, 30% at level 4, and then at level 3, majority, 60%.
Okay.
So, the question is really, and I mean, I don't have the answer to it. We'll just have to see how this evolves. But the question really is it realistic to expect that 5% or very sort of marginal level 5 share to grow significantly by 2027 to ensure that EU has the sourcing flexibility and that importers can source compliant natural gas and crude oil without being penalized? Because it's important to note that there is this indirect effect for producers. The regulation doesn't necessarily directly apply to producers in third countries, because that obviously be an overreach. It applies to importers, that importers must submit certain information or data to competent authorities. So the liability or the risk really lies on importers, a responsibility for them to basically ensure that they ask their exporters or producers for the required data. But we know today that there are deals or long-term contracts now that are being stalled or being paused because of the uncertainty around what will the methane intensity calculation be, which will only be developed by 2027. What will the methane intensity itself be from 2030? also the third party verification protocol, which is needed. So this is something that the regulation prescribes, is that all the MRV reports have to be submitted with a third party verification protocol. But today, the third party verification for OGMP level 5 does not exist. And albeit there are efforts right now to develop these, and industry is really involved in this work as well. It might take some time. Similarly, also for the standards itself, for example, ISO is developing standards for MRV as well, for measurement reporting
and we've been helping in that as IOGP. I know that we've had our own expert meetings to help develop the ISO standards for that.
Indeed. So IOGP is involved in the upstream segment and developing these standards or helping the global community come together and sitting down and putting something together that would be appropriate for the regulation. Because at the end of the day, the Commission has to accept those standards as well.
Yes.
And going back to the imports, so another element is the elephant in the room, which is traceability.
A term the Commission doesn't like, apparently.
Yes, so I wouldn't. This is a tricky one. So when I say traceability, is really just identifying the producer.
Yes.
Right.
Knowing where the molecule
comes
produced.
from.
Comes from. Okay.
Because the regulation basically asks that certain actions have to be dealt with at the producer level. So what we're looking at is now, you have simple value chains and then you have more complex value chains. But the simple ones, which are, let's say, a bit more old school and perhaps less significant today, where you basically have a direct commercial link between the importer and the producer.
Yes.
Where the data it's easier for these parties to track or to supply this data or share this data. So we don't necessarily see that there could be an issue with the simple value chains per se, but in the market like the US, and the global LNG market at large, where we call the complex value chains, where you have multiple producers and basins producing the molecules, but then those are putting in processing pipelines, gathering pipelines, shipped across or transported. All of these segments of the value chain in the US are operated by different parties, and we're talking about thousands and thousands of different entities, plus traders that are involved in trading of these molecules. So from the realistic perspective, we just lose. It's just impossible to track these molecules in these value chains. So there needs to be an approach for the industry that is workable and that also, in a way, appeases the requirements of the regulation. How the certificates can help us, or the industry and the importers, to comply with importer requirements. That is an important aspect. This cannot be solved overnight, because there's other approaches out there as well. So we don't want to single out one approach. I think importers have to be able to choose whatever compliance approach suits them, right, on their commercial realities, whether they have direct access to the exporter or a producer or not. At the end of the day, there needs to be openness to all of the approaches, but it will be the member states that basically give green light or rubber stamp these approaches. And this is where the fragmentation, a risk of fragmentation, that we want to avoid as well. We want the member states to come together and agree, okay, these are the approaches that we would support, and then let the market fill in the service providers or those providers that deal with certification or whatnot, fill that space.
Okay. So moving on to domestic, we still produce some oil and gas in Europe. That production is really necessary to sort of maintain a minimum security of supply. What are the main requirements, and especially the most problematic ones?
I think you rightly put it. The domestic production is really important. So we shouldn't, let's say, overlook the impact and implications of the regulation on domestic operators as well. As I mentioned, there's both mitigation and monitoring, reporting and verification requirements for domestic operators as well. So on leak detection and repairs, there's quite extensive requirements on operators across the value chain. I'll focus on the upstream perspective. One of the issues that we see is that there's a requirement to go after very insignificant leaks down to 1 gram an hour, which is minuscule. 1 gram an hour, that's the repair threshold the regulation sets. The Commission, as I mentioned, will set the minimum detection limits in the coming months. That implies that the minimum detection limits will be even lower than the repair thresholds because they have to be.
Detect first, repair later.
Exactly. That's sort of, we call it the type 2 LDAR survey, and then the type 1 LDAR survey deals with, or the repair threshold is 17 grams an hour, which is, let's say, widely accepted best industry practice in the US and some other jurisdictions as well, like in Canada, where the 17 grams an hour, what we've seen from many studies is that 17 grams an hour, you can already capture majority of your total methane leaks. So there is this rule of thumb that very few leaks account for the largest amount of total leak volumes. So it's a no-brainer that we should prioritize bigger leaks first and get those resources where it's needed from the operator's perspective. Also, different operational realities will mean that in one region or another region, or be it offshore or onshore, the approaches should be different.
Yes.
But there is quite let's say, a blanket approach when it comes to LDAR and the regulation. There are different frequencies for different types of components, so that is very much welcome.
Frequency of sending in teams to carry out leak detection.
Indeed, so frequencies for the surveys themselves. But then the thresholds sort of remain the same for across the value chain, also depending on the different components, obviously. But we don't see the 1 gram an hour is needed now. Let's deal with the larger leaks first.
Because I think there's a conception that this is an industry that has a lot of resources and therefore can tackle everything at the same time. But there is a capacity problem here. We know this because we talk to the operators. Having that blanket approach would mean that the required resources to be mobilized would be immense for a small mitigation effect. Is it fair to say that could, if you go after the tinier leaks, you could actually emit more than fixing it? Is that an actual thing that we can affirm in this industry?
Certainly, if you require to fly out to your offshore platforms with a helicopter, I mean, it's not just an in and out. You need to get your helicopter to fly your sensors. You probably put your drones on the ships, the vessels going to the platforms themselves. If you have multiple platforms, you're not going to be there only for a day. You need to book out 2 or 3 weeks time just in case there's bad weather. If you need to redo your survey just in case something has gone wrong. So it's not just an in and out. It does really take a lot of planning, and industry is doing that already. But the timeline that's given to the industry is just not implementable in some aspects. So if you require flying out with a helicopter often to get those leaks, or driving out to remote sites where you already have sensors that continuously, for example, track methane emissions or measure methane emissions, and have safety systems in place as well to do so, there indeed you may end up in sort of total GHG emission perspective. You may end up emitting more than you actually are solving or repairing with this.
So you mentioned the LDAR dimension. There are other requirements that sort of pose the same questions in terms of efficiency, but also feasibility relative to the timeline. And I believe that one of them is replacement of flare stacks. So maybe just very briefly to remind us why there are flare stacks in place and what the regulation is asking industry to do.
So flare stacks, in every operation there's a flare stack upstream, is used for safety purposes, just to avoid a platform or the site explodes if there is a buildup in pressure. So that's needed to basically burn off the methane for safety purposes. So we agree that there should not be routine venting and flaring, but there needs to be some flexibility when it comes for safety reasons, for operational reasons. Now, the regulation limits the venting and flaring, so there's a ban on routine flaring, and there's limitations on venting and flaring as well. But there's an important aspect is that operators already by February next year 5th of February next year,
2026,
have to ensure that their flare stacks meet a certain removal destruction efficiency of 99%, meaning that 99% of
the methane,
the methane is basically burnt.
Yeah.
It doesn't enter the atmosphere.
Where are we today in terms of efficiency?
I think that from what we hear from operators is about 98%. It's
98.
like, let's say the gold standard.
The gold standard is 98.
98.
And the regulation asks operators to move to 99.
99%.
Okay.
The tricky part here is that it's now unclear on how operators need to prove that's 99%, because it's never going to be a static 99%. I don't want to go into technicalities, but if you were to look at the flaring events, like the percentage goes up and down significantly
because of the pressure as well.
Exactly. Yeah. I think the issue that we have is that operators are given 18 months, so by 2026 February, to implement this, when in reality it takes about 3 to 5 years for operators, the whole, let's say, investment cycle and project cycle, to procure, or to do assessments first, to procure, to make the changes in your platform, because it's not just changing a little component on top of your flare. It's really
a flare stack.
It's a flare stack, and we're talking about thousands and thousands of kilograms, maybe tons of steel or metal that has to be replaced, and that takes time. So the regulation by default is already setting some of the operators up for failure who have to change those flare stacks. So what we are asking is to introduce some flexibility to recognize that there are these steps in the project timeline that have to be taken into account, and for competent authorities to give some flexibility and allowing operators to get to where they need to in a bit more time. A lot of operators will already be in a good place, and we've heard that, but there will be operators also that will struggle or are struggling now. So this flexibility is very much needed.
There is, I believe, another thing that our industry sort of regrets in the regulation, which is, and again, this goes back to the point of this regulation being very prescriptive, which is that not only does it set those thresholds, it also tells operators how to do it and how not to do it. Just as a reminder, methane detection can be done at different levels, from satellite down to a handheld camera, by a person on the ground. So, but the regulation does go into a bit of detail on that. Can you maybe tell us what that detail is?
Yeah. So I think one of the major missed opportunities in the regulation is the recognition, or practical recognition, of the use of advanced detection technologies. You'll see in the regulation there is a paragraph that allows operators to use these if they meet certain criteria, and certain criteria that they need to meet or be able to achieve the same levels, minimum detection levels that will be prescribed by the Commission, which will be lower than 17 grams an hour. But the issue is that advanced detection technologies, let's say sensors mounted on drones that the industry is already using effectively, that comes in very handy, especially for offshore operations.
So you can send a drone, that's technology, that's what it's used for.
Exactly.
Well, at the end of the day.
It's a no-brainer, but because this criteria is already established in the regulation, there is no sensors out there that can meet 17 grams an hour, yet alone 1 gram an hour. In practice, we're talking about 1 to 3 kilograms an hour of a detection limit for sensors, for drones, for example. So that's a huge missed opportunity for in the regulation.
So hang on. Let me get this right. So the equipment is there. I mean, it's on the market. We already use it, etc. But how does the regulation prevent their use? What is it? Does it actually say you cannot use, sensors mounted on drones? Or is it because of the threshold that they get basically disqualified or whatever you want to call it?
It's the latter. Is basically the use or prescribing the thresholds de facto exclude certain technologies. You will have service operators out there that say they can do this and that and meet these very low thresholds.
Yes.
But from operational perspective and what we hear, that is usually not, let's say, right, are correct, there are a lot of different environments or externalities that impact your surveys, be it the clouds, be it the wind, be it the rain, snow, temperature, humidity, a really long list of these things that cannot be accounted for in these, let's say, laboratory tests where these technologies are being tested. And even if these technologies can meet those require, as I said, those very low detection limits, in practice, that is less likely.
Yeah, there's the numbers on the paper, and then what you get when you actually go out there in the field and use the technology. And there's always going to be somebody that says, my tech can do this, understandably, probably for business reasons. The question is also, one, as you said, what is the actual effectiveness on the ground when used in different moments of the year in different places? But there's also scalability issues somewhere.
Yeah, indeed. And I think what was important to know is that in the past years, we've seen exponential growth in the service providers and technology providers and the capacity or capabilities of this technology. So it's very promising.
It's very good because that good regulation should also encourage that to scale those things up and obviously bring prices down, make it accessible for operators. So, yeah.
But it can also limit or disqualify promising technologies that can really target or tackle, as I said, those methane emissions and those leaks that really matter for the environment, instead of going down to very insignificant volumes or thresholds of methane leaks. I think looking out to the future, I think it would be preferential to have, let's say, a sort of a multi-tier approach where the operators are given multiple options, where they can choose whatever they deem necessary for their operational realities, be it handheld devices, being sensors, being drones, flyovers with planes or helicopters, because no site is the same, no operation is the same. You have different maturity in the infrastructure, different capabilities, and so forth.
So have regulation that takes the reality of the industry it's regulating into account.
Exactly.
Okay. Right. So we mentioned the challenges, but why should anybody in Europe care, or why should politicians care, or member states, officials care about this? What would be the impact? You mentioned the risk to contracting, and I was, speaking to somebody who is involved in advising importers and suppliers into, crafting their agreements. And he was telling us that he witnessed an agreement fail because of the requirements that are not feasible in the methane regulation, because nobody wanted to accept the risk the other guy was trying to pass on to him.
So maybe to go back to the dynamic between the importer, exporter, producer, at this point it's true. We've heard on several accounts that there are issues with current negotiations for long-term contracts, which are obviously really important to fill in the space for what's to come from 2027 as EU moves away from Russian natural gas. And what we see is that importers are trying to move that liability or risk down the value chain or up the value chain to the exporter or to the producer. Which obviously is a challenging situation. You might have an exporter that cannot guarantee, an exporter that sources from different or multiple producers on a spot market in the US, for example, that cannot guarantee that they will have the required data information that is needed for the purpose of importer requirements. So they would say, we would rather not engage in the commercial activity with you, and therefore there would not be the necessary flows or volumes coming to European Union, which would then mean the EU would have to look towards alternative suppliers, which they are limited. So if you have to look for alternatives, that would obviously increase the cost for the market, for the importer, but then essentially also down the value chain for the consumers, being for the businesses. So that would affect competitiveness. But also households would have a great impact on energy poverty. It's something to look at, and you can look at the data on how much we're importing and look at where we're importing from and assessing how likely those countries would be MRV equivalent or not as a first step. But currently, there's no country. But then you also need to look at, okay, what is the share of, I mentioned the 5% of the whole value chain methane emissions being reported under OGMP. Unfortunately, there's no data on what it means in terms of the breakdown for upstream and in terms of the companies.
Yeah.
But you can make sense of where we could land in 1 or 2 years. You could look at potentially having the same scale of situation as we did in 2022 with the energy crisis. So that's something to keep in mind. So this is serious if you really follow the letter of the law.
Right.
And therefore, we are asking for these the safe flexibilities to some extent, but also targeted adjustments to the regulation itself to ensure that we don't land again in 2022 and we need to relive the crisis again. We see that some member states are looking at implementing things in a more flexible way. But if you have sort of messages from the Commission and member states about the flexibility and sort of temporary exemptions here and there, it doesn't really give the market the legal certainty because at the end of the day, it is the companies, legal entities that are making the deals, signing the contracts. So, everything has to be squared up, to the point. So any, let's say, unwritten certainties that are out there are, from our perspective, not enough. And also from our perspective, we don't think that secondary legislation, for example, can address these issues.
With industry raising the concerns, with member states raising their concerns, with partners such as the US talking about those challenges, the Commission's response so far has been to say, in the words of Dan Jorgensen, we will not withdraw the regulation. I think, first of all, we need to clarify that the industry is not asking, or any of these stakeholders is not asking for withdrawal of the regulation. It's 5 or 6 fixes in a regulation that has tens, if not 100 provisions. So it's about very targeted changes. And I think it's also important to recall that, as you said, it's important to recall that the discussions right now in the institutions about a complete phase out of Russian gas, you could potentially shoot yourself in the foot by making your almost entire alternative supply non-compliant at the same scale, or more or less, or let's say the comparable scale, if you were to follow the regulation by the book, like exactly letter by letter. And the question, therefore, to the policymakers is that an acceptable risk to take? Or do we want to stick to the principle that we are not going to reopen it, even if we know that the risk to the supply exists? Or do we use the coming months, year that remains, to make those changes? Is it possible to fix in the secondary legislation? As far as we know, it's not possible, despite what some people are now starting to argue. I'm very concerned with the fact that this is going to have a security of supply issue. So using this, I see this increasingly as people are talking about it as a negotiation element. People are talking about it for its environmental aspect. They're both true, but the real risk that I think we're seeing now on the horizon, and we're going to look into this even more in the coming weeks and months, is the impact it could have on the market.
I would like to stay optimistic on this. As I mentioned, we're doing this, as we learn, but I agree that there needs to be a more collaborative approach between the Commission and the industry as well. And we're seeing some positive signs on this lately, because industry has the know-how. And again, just to reiterate again and again and again, that we do support the objectives of the regulation, that we're not trying to get rid of the regulation, but rather make sure that it's operational and is proportionate.
All right, thanks a lot, Emils, again for talking to me and to us on this important topic. I want to thank our listeners and viewers for your own time. I hope you learned a lot from this. I think Emils, even if we've been speaking for a while, has only been scratching the surface. So if you ever want to know more about this, do reach out to him or to us. And we'll keep you updated on this file as it progresses, on the next steps, as Emils mentioned. Hopefully, we can solve some of the issues before they become a reality, tackle some of those risks early on, even if we're a bit late already. And in the meantime, again, thanks a lot for your time, for your attention, and we'll see you next time on Drilling Down. Thank you.